The temple of Apollo stood on a hill overlooking the city of Troy, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. The smoke from 100 altars rose into the blue sky like the whispers of 1,000 prayers, curling upward until they disappeared into the bright light of the late summer afternoon. Inside the temple, the air was cool and thick with the smell of incense, and the stone floor was smooth beneath the bare feet of the young girl who knelt before the golden statue of the god. Cassandra was 12 years old, the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, and she had come to the temple to pray for wisdom. Her dark hair fell in waves across her shoulders, and her gray eyes reflected the flickering light of the oil lamps that lined the stone walls. The temple was quiet except for the soft sound of her breathing and the distant echo of birds singing outside the open doors. The sun streamed through the high windows, casting long golden rectangles across the floor, and the dust motes danced in the beams of light like tiny stars fallen to earth. The god Apollo noticed her beauty from the shadows where he stood watching. He decided to offer her a gift, the greatest gift he could give any mortal, the power to see the future as clearly as the present. He stepped forward, and his voice filled the temple like thunder rolling across the plain when he spoke. The sound echoed off the stone walls and the marble columns, reverberating through the sacred space until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. He offered her the gift of prophecy. She would be able to see the past and the present and the future all at once, as if time itself had opened like a book before her eyes. She would know what was coming before it arrived, the fate of cities and the death of kings, the arrival of strangers on the shore, and the departure of souls to the underworld. She would see the faces of the dead before they died, and the faces of the unborn before they drew their first breath. She would be the voice of truth in a world that preferred lies. Cassandra accepted without understanding what the gift would cost. She was a child, and children do not know that power carries a price that must be paid. She knelt before the statue of the god, with her head bowed and her hands raised in supplication, and she whispered her acceptance to the golden figure that watched her from the altar. The statue seemed to glow in the dim light, its golden surface warm and alive, and the eyes of the god appeared to follow her movements as she shifted her weight on the cold stone floor. The god touched her lips with his fingers, and the gift entered her like a river flooding a dry valley. The visions came in a flood, too many at once, too fast to sort or understand. She saw everything in that single terrible moment. The faces of the dead and the living and the unborn, the flames consuming the towers of Troy, the blood running through the streets where she had played as a child. She saw her father kneeling at the altar of Zeus with his hands tied behind his back, and she saw the sword that would end his life. She saw her brothers falling on the battlefield one by one, Hector and Troilus and Deiphobus and Polites, their bodies covered in blood and dust. She saw her mother kneeling before the Greek captains with chains around her wrists, A queen reduced to a slave, her face wet with tears. She saw the Greek ships crossing the Aegean Sea, 1,000 vessels stretching from horizon to horizon, their white sails catching the wind like the wings of enormous birds. The sea was dark and choppy, and the ships rose and fell with the waves, their wooden hulls creaking and groaning with the strain of the long journey. She saw the 10 years of war that would follow, the bodies piled high outside the walls, the hunger and the disease and the endless waiting. She saw the wooden horse, dark and enormous, standing on the beach where the Greek camp had been. She saw the soldiers hiding inside its belly, their swords and shields and spears pressed against the wooden walls, their hearts beating with anticipation. She saw her own death, years later, in the palace of Mycenae, under the blade of a jealous queen. She saw the axe rising and falling, the blood spreading across the stone floor, the darkness coming to take her at last. The visions swirled around her like a storm, and she could not separate them from the present moment. The past and the future collapsed into the now, and she was everywhere at once, in Troy and in Mycenae, in the temple and on the battlefield, alive and dead and unborn. She screamed, and her voice echoed off the stone walls of the temple, bouncing back at her from every direction. The incense smoke swirled around her as if stirred by an invisible wind, and the oil lamps flickered and nearly went out. The flames bent low and then sprang back up, casting wild shadows on the walls that looked like dancing figures. The god stepped back and looked at her with cold eyes. She had refused to be his. She would not love him, or lie with him, or bear his children. She had chosen her own path, and the god was not merciful to those who rejected him. He could not take back the gift, because once given it was permanent, but he could add to it in a way that would make it a burden rather than a blessing. No one would believe her visions. She would see the truth, and she would speak the truth, and every word she spoke would fall on deaf ears. Her family would call her mad. Her people would pity her. Her enemies would mock her. She would spend her entire life screaming warnings into the wind, and no one would ever listen. He disappeared into the shadows, and the temple fell silent. The incense had burned out completely, leaving only the smell of cold ash and old stone. The candles had died, one by one, until the only light came from the setting sun outside the open doors. The darkness of the temple was the darkness of her future, and Cassandra knelt alone on the cold stone floor with her gray eyes wet and her hands shaking. She did not know that she would spend the rest of her life screaming warnings that no one would heed. She only knew that something precious had been taken from her, something she had not known she possessed, the simple comfort of being heard and believed. The years passed, and Cassandra grew from a frightened girl into a young woman of remarkable appearance. Her dark hair and gray eyes made her the most beautiful of King Priam's many daughters, and her tall, slender figure drew the attention of princes and ambassadors who came to Troy from distant lands. But the gift did not fade with time, and the curse did not lift. She saw everything, the small things and the great, the arrival of strangers on the shore, and the death of kings in their beds, the birth of children who would die young, and the fall of houses that had stood for centuries. She spoke of what she saw, and no one believed her. The palace of Troy was a maze of corridors and courtyards, filled with the sounds of servants and soldiers and petitioners. Cassandra moved through it like a ghost, her gray eyes seeing things that others could not perceive. She would pause in the middle of a hallway, frozen by a vision of a fire that would burn a building that had not yet been built. She would stop mid-sentence at the dinner table, her gaze going distant as she watched a ship sink in a sea she had never seen. The other members of the royal family learned to ignore her silences, to talk over her, to pretend that she was not there. She became invisible in plain sight. Her father, King Priam, loved her as a father loves a daughter, but he did not understand her visions. She would come to him in the middle of the night, her gray eyes wide with fear, her voice trembling with urgency, and she would tell him of fires and floods and foreign invaders who were coming to destroy their city. He would listen for a while, nodding his white head, stroking his long beard, and then he would send for her maids to take her back to her room. He would whisper to his advisors that his daughter was ill, that her mind had been touched by the gods in a strange and terrible way, that there was nothing to be done but offer sacrifices and pray. He would sigh and turn back to his maps and his letters, the weight of his crown pressing down on his brow. Her mother, Queen Hecuba, offered sacrifices to Apollo on her daughter's behalf almost every day. She burned incense at the altars of 100 lesser deities, hoping that one of them might have the power to lift the curse. She consulted oracles and seers and wandering priests, paying them in gold and silver and precious jewels for their prophecies and potions. Cassandra watched her mother pray, knowing that the incense would burn to nothing, knowing that the god would not listen, knowing that the silence would continue until the end of her days. She would sit in the corner of the temple while her mother knelt at the altar, and she would watch the smoke rise and disappear, and she would say nothing. Her brother Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, protected her from those who mocked her. He was tall and broad, with arms thick from years of training, and a face scarred by 100 battles. He loved her fiercely and defended her against the whispers of the court, but he did not trust her visions. When she warned him that the Greeks would come, that the ships would darken the sea, that the war would last 10 years and end in fire and blood, he placed his heavy hand on her shoulder and told her to rest. The walls of Troy were strong, he said, and he was strong, and no enemy would ever enter their home. He was wrong, and Cassandra knew he was wrong, but she could not make him see the truth that was so clear to her. She would watch him walk away, his armor gleaming in the sun, and she would see the blood that would soon cover his shield. Her other brother, Paris, the handsomest prince of Troy, paid no attention to her warnings at all. He was too busy with his own pleasures, his own schemes, his own dangerous love for Helen of Sparta. Cassandra warned him not to sail across the Aegean Sea, not to enter the palace of Menelaus, not to take the queen away from her husband. She told him that his actions would bring disaster to their city, that thousands would die because of his selfishness, that the name of Troy would become a byword for destruction. He laughed at her, kissed her forehead, and told her not to worry. He sailed across the Aegean anyway, and he took Helen from her husband's palace, and the war began. When the Greek ships appeared on the horizon, 1,000 vessels stretching as far as the eye could see, the people of Troy gathered on the walls and wept. The ships filled the entire bay, their masts like a forest of bare trees, their sails like clouds massing for a storm. Cassandra stood among the people on the walls without speaking, her gray eyes fixed on the distant fleet. She had warned them for years, and they had ignored her, and now the enemy was at their gates. The smell of salt and tar and wood filled the air, and the sound of the waves against the hulls of 1,000 ships was like the beating of a giant heart. The war lasted 10 years, exactly as she had known it would. Every day brought new horrors, and Cassandra watched them all from her window in the palace. She watched her brothers die, one by one, until the list of the dead filled 100 scrolls. She watched the great warrior Achilles slay her brother Hector and drag his body behind a chariot around the walls of Troy, the dust rising in a cloud behind the speeding wheels. She watched her father weep at the gates of the city, begging for the return of his son's body, his white hair stained with ashes and his voice broken. She watched the body of Hector circle the city walls 12 times, and each pass brought a fresh wave of grief that rolled through the city like a tide of darkness. She watched the Amazon queen Penthesilea ride to Troy with her warrior women, brave and fierce and beautiful, their armor gleaming in the sun. She knew that the queen would die before the first week was over, that her bravery would not save her, that her beauty would not protect her from the sword of Achilles. She warned her, begged her to turn back, but Penthesilea did not listen. She died on the battlefield, and the Amazon women carried her body back to their ships with tears streaming down their faces. The horses of the Amazons galloped through the gates of Troy. Their riders slumped over their saddles, their armor dented and broken, their shields scarred by the swords of the Greeks. She watched her youngest brother Troilus, barely a man, ambushed by Achilles in the temple of Apollo, the same god who had cursed her. She had warned Troilus not to leave the palace, not to go outside the walls, not to trust the silence that had fallen over the battlefield. He did not listen. He died in the temple, and his blood stained the stone floor where Cassandra had knelt as a child. She heard the news from a servant who came running through the palace, his face white, his hands shaking, and she felt something inside her break. The war continued. The bodies piled higher. The walls held. In the 10th year of the war, something strange happened. The Greek camp fell silent, and the fires that had burned on the plain for a decade went out, one by one, until only the dark shapes of abandoned tents remained. The ships that had filled the harbor for 10 years began to sail away, their white sails disappearing over the horizon until the sea was empty and the beach was bare. The plain where the Greek army had camped for 10 years was now a wasteland of empty tents and cold cooking fires and abandoned armor. The wind blew through the deserted camp, stirring the flaps of the tents and sending bits of paper and cloth flying through the air. The Trojans watched from the walls, confused and suspicious. They had been fighting for so long that the silence was more frightening than the sound of battle. The memory of peace had faded from their minds, and they did not know how to interpret the absence of war. They stood on the walls in the morning light, shielding their eyes against the sun, trying to understand what they were seeing. The Greek camp was empty. The Greek ships were gone. The war had ended, or so it seemed. Then they saw the horse standing on the sand where the Greek camp had been. It was enormous, built of dark wood that had been polished until it gleamed in the afternoon light. It was so tall that its legs cast long shadows across the entire beach, and so wide that its belly could hold 20 men standing shoulder to shoulder. The Trojans marveled at its size and its beauty, and they wondered what it could mean. The horse stood silent and still, like a creature from another world, alien and mysterious. Cassandra saw the horse from her window in the palace, and she knew at once what it was. The Greek soldiers were hiding inside its wooden belly, their swords and shields and spears pressed against the walls, their hearts beating with anticipation. She could feel them in her mind, 30 men packed into the narrow space, their breath held, their hands gripping their weapons, their thoughts filled with the promise of blood. She saw the trap, the lie, the death that waited beneath the wooden skin. The wood of the horse was dark and smooth, and the seams where the planks joined were barely visible. The Greeks had built it well, with skill and patience and murderous intent. She ran through the streets of Troy, her bare feet slapping against the warm stone, her dark hair flying behind her in the wind. She screamed her warning to everyone who would listen, her voice rising above the noise of the celebrating crowds. The people of Troy had heard her screams for 10 years, and they had learned to ignore her. They looked at her with pity and turned away, shaking their heads and whispering to each other about the poor, cursed princess who saw things that were not there. She was mad. Everyone knew that. A victim of the gods, a creature to be pitied and ignored. The children laughed at her as she ran past, and the old women crossed themselves and looked away. She found her father in the courtyard of the palace, standing among his advisors and giving orders for a celebration feast. His white beard was neatly combed, and his crown of gold sat on his head. He was smiling for the first time in 10 years, and his eyes were bright with relief. The advisors were laughing and slapping each other on the back, and the servants were running back and forth carrying trays of food and jugs of wine. She fell to her knees before him and grabbed his hands, kissing his fingers, begging him to listen. Her voice was raw from screaming, and her throat burned with every word. The horse was filled with Greek soldiers, she told him. They would wait until night fell, and then they would climb out of the horse and open the gates. The army would return from behind the island where they were hiding, and Troy would burn. Her hands were cold and shaking, and her tears fell on his fingers as she spoke. Priam gently pulled his hands away from her grasp. He placed his weathered hands on her head and looked into her gray eyes with a mixture of love and sadness. The war was over, he said. The Greeks had gone home. The gods had given them victory, and they should be grateful. She was tired, exhausted by the long years of fear and loss, and she needed to rest. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were distant, already thinking of the feast, of the celebration, of the new beginning for Troy. He turned and walked away, his advisors following close behind him. They were already discussing the details of the feast, the wine to be poured, the meat to be roasted, the songs to be sung. Their voices faded as they disappeared through the doors of the palace, and Cassandra was left alone in the courtyard. She knelt alone in the courtyard, her gray eyes wet, her hands empty, her voice silent. The stone was cold beneath her knees, and the sun was warm on her back. She did not know how long she stayed there, but when she finally rose, her legs were stiff and her hands were shaking. The shadows had shifted, and the sun had moved across the sky, and the celebration was already beginning in the streets outside. She found her brother Paris in his chambers, sitting with Helen on a couch covered in purple cloth. They had survived the war, and they were celebrating their survival with wine and music and each other. Helen was still beautiful, her dark hair and pale skin untouched by the years of siege. Paris was still handsome, his curly hair and smooth face showing no trace of the battles he had fought. They were happy in a way that seemed almost cruel to the dead who had fallen around them. The room smelled of wine and perfume and the sweet smoke of burning incense. Cassandra stood in the doorway and warned them about the horse, about the Greeks hiding inside, about the fire that would consume the city before morning. Her voice was steady now, no longer raw with screaming, but calm and cold as the stone floor of the temple where she had received her curse. Her gray eyes moved from Paris to Helen and back again, and she saw the fear that flickered behind their wine-drunken smiles. Paris looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, drunk on wine and relief. He said she was always so dramatic, that she had been dramatic since she was a child, that the war had made her worse. The war was over, and she should drink with them and forget her visions for one night. He poured a cup of wine and held it out to her, but she did not take it. Cassandra looked at Helen, and for a moment she saw the future reflected in the other woman's dark eyes. Helen would survive the fall of Troy. She would return to Sparta with her husband Menelaus, and she would live a long and comfortable life. But she would never be happy, never be at peace, never be free of the guilt that haunted her dreams. She would wake in the night screaming from visions of the flames, and no one would comfort her. Cassandra turned away and walked back into the streets without another word. She found the old priest of Apollo kneeling before the altar in the temple where she had received her gift and her curse. He was very old now, bent and wrinkled, his hands shaking as he offered incense to the god. The smoke rose in thin columns, gray and faint, disappearing into the shadows of the high ceiling. The temple was dark and quiet, and the only light came from the candles burning on the altar. She grabbed his robes with both hands and pulled him toward the door, pointing at the horse that stood like a dark mountain on the distant beach. He had served Apollo for 60 years, she told him. The people would listen to him. They would believe him. He could save the city where she had failed. Her voice was desperate, and her grip on his robes was tight. The priest gently removed her hands from his robes and looked at her with kind, tired eyes. He said that the gods did not always speak clearly, and that mortals did not always hear. The war was over, and they should pray that peace would follow. He returned to the altar and knelt again, offering more incense to the god who had cursed her. Cassandra stood alone in the temple, surrounded by the smoke of 1,000 failed prayers, and she did not scream again. There was no point. There had never been any point. The sun set over Troy, painting the sky in shades of red and gold and purple, and the people gathered in the streets to celebrate the end of the war. Torches were lit along every avenue, filling the city with a warm, flickering light. Wine was poured from heavy clay jugs into cups of gold and silver, and the sound of music and laughter filled the air for the first time in 10 years. The musicians played lyres and flutes and drums, and the dancers whirled through the crowds, their colorful dresses spinning like flowers in the wind. The Trojans dragged the horse through the gates, straining against ropes and pulleys, sweating and laughing at their own effort. The wooden wheels groaned against the stone pavement, and the walls of the horse creaked with the weight of the men hidden inside. The Greek soldiers held their breath in the darkness, their hands gripping their swords, their bodies pressed against each other in the narrow space. The air inside the horse was thick and hot, and the smell of sweat and oil and leather filled the confined space. Every creak of the wood made them freeze. Every shout from outside made them reach for their weapons. Cassandra watched from her window as the horse passed beneath her on its way to the center of the city. She could feel the men inside more clearly now, 30 of them, their hearts beating like drums in the silence, their thoughts filled with hatred for the city that had defied them for so long. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone of her window frame and closed her gray eyes. The stone was rough against her skin, and the coolness of it seeped into her bones. She saw the night ahead in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror scattered across the floor. Her father kneeling at the altar of Zeus, with his hands tied behind his back, the sword rising and falling, his white blood soaking into the stone. Her mother standing before the Greek captains with chains around her wrists, her face wet with tears, her voice raised in a prayer that no god would answer. Her sisters dragged away by their hair, their clothes torn, their screams fading into the roar of the fire. Her brothers cut down in the streets, their bodies left where they fell, their blood running in rivulets between the stones. She opened her eyes and looked at the horse one last time. The horse stopped in the center of the city, and the Trojans gathered around it, marveling at its size and its beauty. Children climbed on its wooden legs, laughing and shouting, pretending to ride the great beast into battle. Old men touched its polished belly, wondering at the skill of the craftsmen who had built it. Women offered prayers to the gods who had sent such a gift, their voices rising in hymns of thanksgiving and praise. The celebration continued. The music grew louder, the wine flowed faster, and the people of Troy danced in the torchlight until their feet were sore and their voices were hoarse. They had survived 10 years of war, 10 years of hunger and fear and loss, and they were grateful to be alive. Cassandra walked away from the window and lay down on her bed. She did not sleep. She watched the moonlight move across the ceiling, slow and indifferent, and she waited. The bed was soft, and the pillows were cool, but her body was tense, and her mind would not rest. The night deepened. The music stopped, one by one, as the musicians grew tired and put down their instruments. The laughter faded, replaced by the soft murmur of sleepy voices and the sound of doors closing. The torches burned low, their flames flickering in the cool night breeze that came in from the sea. The city grew quiet, and the silence settled over Troy like a blanket. Inside the wooden horse, the Greek soldiers began to move. The trapdoor opened with a soft creak, and the first man climbed down, his sword drawn, his eyes searching the darkness. He was tall and broad, with a scar across his cheek and a dark beard covering his jaw. He landed silently on the stone pavement and looked around, his hand raised to signal the others. Then another man climbed down, and another, until 30 Greek soldiers stood in the silent streets of Troy. Their armor was dark, and their swords were sharp, and their hearts were filled with the cold fire of vengeance. They moved through the city like shadows, their swords flashing in the dim light of the dying torches. They killed the guards at the gates, slit their throats before they could cry out, and pulled the heavy wooden doors open. The gates swung open with a groan, and the army that had sailed behind the island of Tenedos began to pour through, thousands of men with swords and shields and torches. The first scream cut through the silence just before dawn. Troy burned through the night and into the morning, and the flames rose from 100 buildings, lighting the sky with a terrible orange glow that could be seen from miles away. The smoke was thick and black, filled with the ashes of palaces and temples and homes and it rose in enormous columns that blotted out the sun. The streets were filled with running figures, women clutching children, old people hobbling toward gates that no longer stood, men with swords defending their families against impossible odds. The sound of battle was everywhere, the clash of steel and the screams of the dying and the roar of the flames. Cassandra watched from her window as the city she loved died beneath her. Her father was killed at the altar of Zeus, dragged across the stones by the son of Achilles, stabbed with a sword while he begged for mercy from the god who watched without intervening. His blood pooled around the altar, red and warm, soaking into the cracks between the stones. Her mother was captured and bound, a queen reduced to a slave, her hands tied behind her back with rough rope that cut into her skin. She was led away with the other women of Troy, their heads bowed, their voices silent, their tears falling on the dusty ground. Her sisters were pulled from their rooms and dragged through the streets, their clothes torn, their hair loose, their screams fading into the roar of the fire. Cassandra did not weep. There was no time for weeping, and her tears had been exhausted long ago. A Greek soldier found her in her room. He was young, barely more than a boy, with a thin beard and scared eyes. His uniform was covered in blood that was not his own, and his hands were shaking when he raised his sword. He hesitated when he saw her face, her gray eyes calm and steady, her dark hair falling in waves across her shoulders. He lowered his sword and told her that the king had chosen her for himself. Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek army, the man who had sacrificed his own daughter for favorable winds 10 years before, had seen her and wanted her. Cassandra walked past the soldier without looking at him. She walked down the stairs, through the burning palace, into the courtyard where the Greek captains were dividing the spoils of victory. Agamemnon stood among them, tall and proud, with a golden crown on his head and a purple cloak over his shoulders. He smiled when he saw her, a smile that did not reach his cold eyes, and he told her that she would come with him to Mycenae, that she would be his. She did not answer. There was nothing to say. The journey across the sea took many weeks, and Cassandra spent most of it standing at the bow of the ship, watching the water, not speaking to anyone. The sailors avoided her gaze and whispered among themselves that she was cursed, that she brought bad luck, that Agamemnon should throw her overboard before she caused the ship to sink. She heard their whispers and said nothing. The wind was cold on her face, and the salt spray wet her hair, and the sky above her was gray and endless. The ship rose and fell with the waves, and Cassandra watched the horizon shift and change. She saw things in the water that no one else could see, ships that had sunk long ago, bodies that floated beneath the surface, faces that stared up at her with empty eyes. She did not speak of these things. There was no point. When she reached Mycenae, the palace of Agamemnon, she walked through the gates and felt the eyes of the queen upon her. Clytemnestra was standing in the doorway of the great hall, her red hair tied back from her pale face. her eyes cold as winter stone. She had been waiting for 10 years, 10 years of loneliness and betrayal and rage, and she was not a woman who forgave. She looked beautiful in a terrible way, like a figure from an old myth with sharp features and thin lips and a smile that promised nothing but pain. Her eyes held the cold fire of a dying star, and when she looked at Cassandra, the younger woman felt a chill run down her spine. In the days that followed, Cassandra explored the palace of Mycenae and learned its secrets. She found the axe that Clytemnestra had hidden behind the tapestry in the bath chamber, its blade sharpened to a killing edge. She saw the net that the queen had woven to trap her husband, a fine mesh of silk and rope that would close around him when he least expected it. She saw the blade that would fall on his neck, and she saw her own death as well. The same axe, the same blade, her blood mingling with the blood of the king who had claimed her. She did not try to escape. She did not warn Agamemnon of what was coming. She did not beg Clytemnestra for mercy. She waited. On the night of the murder, Cassandra stood alone in the courtyard of the palace, looking up at the stars. They were the same stars that had shone over Troy on the night the horse was dragged through the gates, the same stars that had watched her scream her warnings into the empty air, the same stars that had seen everything and done nothing to help. The courtyard was quiet, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the olive trees that grew along the walls. Clytemnestra came out of the shadows, and the axe was in her hand. The blade caught the light of the moon, and the edge was sharp enough to cut through bone. The queen's face was white in the moonlight, and her red hair was loose around her shoulders, and her eyes were bright with the madness of her purpose. A scream came from inside the palace, cut short before it could echo, followed by the sound of falling water and a heavy body hitting the stone floor. Clytemnestra turned and walked inside, her footsteps steady and sure, and Cassandra followed her. Agamemnon lay in the bath, the net tangled around his body, the axe buried in his neck. His eyes were open, and his mouth was open, and his blood spread across the surface of the water like the setting sun sinking into the sea. The water was warm and red, and the smell of blood filled the room. The torches flickered on the walls, casting shadows that danced across the scene like mourners at a funeral. Clytemnestra stood over the body of her husband, breathing hard, her hands covered in his blood. She turned to Cassandra and raised the axe for the second time. The blade was heavy, and her arms were tired, but her eyes were steady, and her resolve was strong. The axe caught the light, and the edge gleamed. Cassandra looked at the queen and did not flinch. She had seen this moment 1,000 times, in her visions, in her dreams, in the long hours of the night when sleep would not come. She had known since she was 12 years old that her life would end this way, under a blade, in a foreign land, far from the city where she was born. She did not scream. She did not warn. She did not beg. She had spent her whole life screaming warnings that no one heard, and she was tired of screaming. The blade fell, The blood spilled. The darkness came. The temple of Apollo still stands beneath the ruins of Troy, buried under layers of earth and stone, and the memory of a war that ended 3,000 years ago. The walls are cracked, and the columns have fallen, and the statue of the god lies broken on the floor. The incense has long since turned to dust, and the oil lamps have crumbled to fragments, and the golden statue of Apollo is no more than a memory. Weeds grow between the stones, and the wind whistles through the broken roof, and the only visitors are the birds that nest in the fallen columns. But a whisper remains, soft and patient, waiting for someone to listen. The whisper has been waiting for 3,000 years, and it can wait a little longer. The whisper is the echo of Cassandra's voice, the voice that screamed warnings into the empty air, the voice that told the truth when everyone else preferred lies. It faded from the world of the living, but it did not disappear. It settled into the stones of Troy, into the soil of the plain, into the water of the sea. It waited for a voice that would carry it across the centuries. The stars are out now, the same stars that shone over Troy on the night the horse was dragged through the gates. They are cold and distant, as stars have always been, but they are beautiful, and they are eternal, and they will be here long after the last memory of Cassandra has faded from the earth. She is not in Mycenae anymore, not in the courtyard with the cold stones and the distant stars. She is not kneeling in the temple of Apollo, not weeping on the floor of her father's palace, not standing on the walls of Troy with her gray eyes fixed on the horizon. She is in a field where the grass is green and the sun is warm and the sky is blue, and she is young again, with dark hair and gray eyes and a voice that has not been broken by screaming. She is sitting beneath an olive tree with branches spread wide to offer shade from the afternoon heat. The leaves are silver green, and they rustle softly in the warm breeze. Her mother sits beside her, sewing a dress that will never be worn, her dark hair streaked with gray, her kind eyes focused on her work. Her father lies in the grass nearby, his white beard neatly combed, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and peaceful. Her brothers play at the edge of the field, wrestling and laughing and shouting, their voices carrying across the grass like music. A bird with gray feathers and bright eyes sings somewhere in the branches above her, and its song is the same song that the birds sang in Troy, the same song that the birds sang in Mycenae, the same song that birds have sung since the beginning of time. It is a song of mourning, of hope, of the promise that the sun will rise again, even after the longest and darkest night. Cassandra is not waiting for anything. She is not watching for anything. She is not warning anyone. She is simply there, in the stillness, in the light, in the peace that she never found while she was alive. The weight that she carried for so many years has lifted, and her shoulders are light, and her heart is quiet. The bird flies away, and Cassandra watches it go, following its path across the blue sky until it disappears into the distance. She does not wonder where it is going. She does not need to know. She has known enough, she has seen enough, she has spoken enough. The whisper has stopped, and in the silence there is peace. Good night.